Deep within the emerald darkness of the Teutoburg forest, the air hung heavy with the scent of damp earth and impending slaughter. For years, the Germanic tribes had been viewed by Rome as nothing more than fragmented barbarians, a chaotic collection of clans too busy feuding with one another to ever pose a threat to the empire. But Rome had forgotten one thing: a caged wolf never forgets the scent of the wild. At the heart of this story is Arminius, a man of two worlds. Born a prince of the Cherusei, he had been taken to Rome as a child hostage, raised in the lap of luxury, and trained in the pinnacle of Roman military tactics. He wore the armor of a Roman knight, but beneath the polished bronze, his heart beat to the rhythm of the Germanic drums. He watched as the Roman governor, Publius Quinctilius Varus, treated his people like cattle, taxing them into starvation and mocking their gods. Arminius began a double life. By day, he was Varus's most trusted advisor, whispering reassurances into the governor's ear. By night, he rode through the mist, meeting with tribal chieftains who had hated each other for generations. He used his Roman-taught eloquence to forge a fragile unity. "They call us savages," he told them, his voice a low growl by the campfire. "But they bleed the same red blood. We will show them that the forest has teeth." In 9 AD, the trap was sprung. Arminius led 3 elite Roman legions, over 15,000 men, into the narrow, boggy paths of the Teutoburg. As the autumn rain turned the ground into a muddy graveyard, the Roman formations stretched thin. Then, the screaming began. Thousands of Germanic warriors erupted from the Trioline. The Romans, trapped by their own heavy gear and the dense terrain, couldn't form their famous lines. For 3 days, it wasn't a battle, it was a massacre. Varus, seeing his world crumble, fell upon his own sword. When the news reached Rome, Emperor Augustus wandered his palace, banging his head against the walls, crying out, "Varus, give me back my legions." Arminius had done the unthinkable. He had stopped the Roman expansion at the Rhine, forever marking the boundary where the empire's shadow could not fall. While the forests of Germany remained wild, the Roman eye turned toward the misty island of Britannia. They thought the tribes there were soft, easily bought with wine and gold. They were wrong. In the east of England, the Iceni tribe lived in a tense peace under King Prasutagus. But when he died, leaving his kingdom to his daughters and the Roman emperor as co-heirs, the Romans saw an opportunity for total theft. They ignored the will, seized the land, and committed an unforgivable atrocity. They publicly flogged the king's widow, Queen Boudica, and violated her 2 young daughters. They thought they had broken her. Instead, they had forged a goddess of vengeance. Boudica did not weep. She rose. She stood in her war chariot, her long red hair flowing like a river of fire, and called upon the goddess Andraste. Her voice carried across the fens, uniting the Iceni and the neighboring Trinovants in a shared rage. The rebellion was a tidal wave. They marched first on Camulodunum, modern Colchester, the symbol of Roman decadence. The veterans there huddled in a temple, praying for a rescue that never came as the city burned to ashes. Next came Londinium. The Roman commander, Suetonius Paulinus, realized he couldn't hold the city and abandoned it to its fate. Boudica's army left nothing but scorched earth and the screams of those who had stayed behind. The final confrontation at the Battle of Watling Street was a clash of ideology. Boudica led a force that vastly outnumbered the Romans, but the Roman machine was built for survival. Despite her terrifying charge and the raw power of her fury, the Roman discipline held. The Iceni were funneled into a narrow gap and slaughtered. Rather than be paraded through the streets of Rome in chains, Boudica drank poison. She died a free queen, leaving behind a province so traumatized that Rome never truly felt safe in Britain again. Her fire had burned the pride of the Caesars. At the heart of the story is Arminius, a man of two worlds. Born a prince of the Cherusei, he had been taken to Rome as a child hostage, raised in the lap of luxury, and trained in the pinnacle of Roman military tactics. He wore the armor of a Roman knight, but beneath the polished bronze, his heart beat to the rhythm of the Germanic drums. He watched as the Roman governor, Publius Quinctilius Varus, treated his people like cattle, taxing them into starvation and mocking their gods. Arminius began a double life. By day, he was Varus's most trusted advisor, whispering reassurances into the governor's ear. By night, he rode through the mist, meeting with tribal chieftains who had hated each other for generations. He used his Roman-taught eloquence to forge a fragile unity. "They call us savages," he told them, his voice a low growl by the campfire. "But they bleed the same red blood. We will show them that the forest has teeth." In 9 AD, the trap was sprung. Arminius led 3 elite Roman legions, over 15,000 men, into the narrow, boggy paths of the Teutoburg. As the autumn rain turned the ground into a muddy graveyard, the Roman formation stretched thin. Then, the screaming began. Thousands of Germanic warriors erupted from the treeline. The Romans, trapped by their own heavy gear and the dense terrain, couldn't form their famous lines. For 3 days, it wasn't a battle, it was a massacre. Varus, seeing his world crumble, fell upon his own sword. When the news reached Rome, Emperor Augustus wandered his palace, banging his head against the walls, crying out, "Varus, give me back my legions." Arminius had done the unthinkable. He had stopped the Roman expansion at the Rhine, forever marking the boundary where the empire's shadow could not fall. The year was 267 AD, and the Roman Empire was fractured, gasping for air amidst civil wars and plagues. In the golden sands of the Syrian desert, the city-state of Palmyra sat as a jewel of trade and culture. When its ruler was assassinated, his widow, Queen Zenobia, stepped into the light. She was not content to be a mere regent. She envisioned an empire that rivaled Rome itself. Zenobia was a polymath, fluent in multiple languages and a student of philosophy, but she was also a soldier. She rode at the head of her armies, wearing a helmet and mail, marching miles on foot alongside her men. While Rome was distracted, she struck. Her Palmyrene Empire swallowed Egypt, the breadbasket of Rome, and moved deep into Asia Minor. She declared herself Augusta, a title reserved only for the Roman empress, and struck her own coins. She transformed Palmyra into a beacon of intellectual freedom, welcoming scholars and poets who had fled the chaos of the West. But the new Roman Emperor Aurelian was a different breed of leader. Known as the hand-on-sword, he marched east with a singular focus, to reclaim the lost provinces. The two powers clashed at Emesa. Zenobia's heavy cavalry, the cataphracts, were legendary, but Aurelian used clever tactics to tire them out in the desert heat. Eventually, the walls of Palmyra were besieged. Zenobia attempted to flee on a dromedary to seek help from the Persians, but she was captured at the banks of the Euphrates. Though she was led through Rome in golden chains, she won a psychological victory. She had proven that a desert kingdom, led by a woman of intellect and iron, could bring the world's greatest superpower to its knees. Palmyra fell, but the dream of an independent East remained a haunting memory for the Roman Senate. North of the Danube, in the rugged mountains of modern-day Romania, lay the kingdom of Dacia. It was a land of gold mines and jagged peaks, ruled by a king named Decebalus. He was a master of guerrilla warfare and a diplomat who played the Roman factions against each other. For years, Dacia was a thorn in Rome's side, even forcing the empire to pay an embarrassing annual tribute to keep the peace. But in 101 AD, the Emperor Trajan decided that the humiliation must end. He viewed Dacia not just as a threat, but as a prize. The war that followed was one of the most brutal in human history. The Dacians were terrifying warriors, wielding the falx, a curved, two-handed sword that could cleave through a Roman helmet and skull in a single blow. They fought with a religious fervor, believing that death in battle sent them straight to their god, Zalmoxis. Trajan built a massive bridge across the Danube, an engineering marvel intended to signal that no barrier could stop Rome. The legions pushed into the mountains, fighting through treacherous passes and hidden traps. Decebalus retreated to his capital, Sarmizegetusa Regia, a fortress perched high in the clouds. The siege was long and desperate. The Dacians poisoned their own wells and set fire to their stores, refusing to let anything fall into Roman hands. When the capital finally fell, Decebalus fled into the woods. Surrounded by Roman cavalry and refusing to be captured, he cut his own throat beneath an oak tree. Trajan took so much gold from Dacia that he abolished taxes in Rome for a year and funded the greatest forum the city had ever seen. But the Dacian spirit was never truly extinguished. They remained the only people who forced Rome to build a wall of stone, not to keep others out, but to hold the conquered in. While Rome controlled the Mediterranean coast of Africa, they always looked south with fear. Beyond the Atlas Mountains lay the Sahara, a sea of sand that the Romans believed was the end of the world. But deep within that wasteland lived the Garamantes, a sophisticated civilization that turned the desert into an oasis through sheer will and genius. The Garamantes were the masters of the fog era, an underground tunnel system that tapped into fossil water deep beneath the earth. While Roman soldiers died of thirst trying to find them, the Garamantes lived in fortified stone cities with lush gardens. They were the shadows of the sands, using horse-drawn chariots to strike Roman outposts and vanish before a counterattack could be organized. For centuries, Rome tried to civilize or conquer them. Generals like Cornelius Balbus led expeditions deep into the desert, claiming victory, yet the Garamantes simply waited for the Romans to leave and then reclaimed their trade routes. They controlled the flow of salt, gold, and exotic goods, making them the silent gatekeepers of Africa. As the Western Roman Empire began to crumble in the 5th century, the Garamantes remained. While Rome's marble temples were being looted by Vandals and Goths, the Garamantes were still tending their desert gardens. They didn't defeat Rome with a single massive battle, they defeated them with endurance. They proved that the empire's greatest weakness was its inability to adapt to an environment it couldn't map or tax. The Kingdom of the Sands outlasted the City of Seven Hills, a final testament to the fact that some spirits are simply too vast to be contained by Roman borders. The shadows of these fallen empires still stretch across the modern world, proving that while Rome wrote the history books, the blood of the defiant wrote the legends. To truly understand how these kingdoms managed to hold the line against the most efficient killing machine of the ancient world, we must look at the final legacy they left behind, a legacy that eventually contributed to the Eternal City's slow, agonizing collapse. While the Romans were famous for their roads and aqueducts, the Lost Kingdoms had their own ingenious methods of survival. In the dense forests of Germania, the tribes didn't build walls, they used the terrain as a weapon. They created living fortifications by weaving the branches of young trees together to create impenetrable thorny barriers that channeled Roman legions into kill zones. These were not the works of simple barbarians, but of a people who understood the geometry of the hunt. In the south, the Garamantes were performing miracles of hydrology that would have baffled Roman engineers. While Rome relied on surface water and massive gravity-fed aqueducts, the Garamantes were mining water from deep limestone aquifers. Their fog-era system consisted of hundreds of miles of hand-dug tunnels, sloped at a precise angle to prevent evaporation while moving water across the scorching Sahara. This technical mastery meant that when Rome tried to starve these kingdoms into submission, the rebels simply went underground. They lived in a world the Romans couldn't see, and therefore couldn't conquer. It was this hidden strength, the ability to sustain a civilization where the Romans saw only death, that allowed the spirit of defiance to simmer for centuries, waiting for the moment the Roman grip would finally loosen. The impact of these kingdoms wasn't just measured in lost territory or dead soldiers, it was measured in the deep psychological trauma inflicted upon the Roman psyche. After the slaughter in the Teutoburg forest, the Romans became obsessed with the Germanic threat. They spent astronomical sums of money and stationed nearly a third of their entire military force along the Rhine and Danube frontiers. This massive overextension of resources was the first crack in the foundation of the empire. The defiance of queens like Boudica and Zenobia also shattered the Roman illusion of cultural superiority. Rome was a deeply patriarchal society that viewed women as domestic figures. To see a woman leading a chariot charge or commanding an empire of philosophers forced the Roman elite to question their own perceived destiny. These leaders became the monsters under the bed for Roman children, personifications of a world that refused to be tamed by Roman law. Even when Rome won, as they did against Dacia, the victory felt hollow. To commemorate the conquest, Trajan built a massive column in Rome, carved with scenes of the war. But even in these carvings, the Dacians are depicted as noble, fierce, and tragic, not as a defeated rabble. The Romans respected the people they couldn't break, and that respect turned into a creeping fear that one day, the borders would fail and the ghosts of these lost kingdoms would return to claim their revenge. By the late 4th century, the prophecy of the Defiant began to come true. The descendants of the tribes Arminius had united began to cross the Rhine in numbers the dying empire could no longer manage. The Goths, the Vandals, and the Franks didn't just want to destroy Rome. They wanted to take back the autonomy their ancestors had died for. They carried the stories of the Iceni, the Dacians, and the Palmyrines in their oral traditions, fueling a fire that had been smoldering for 400 years. When the Visigoths finally sacked Rome in 410 AD, it was the ultimate irony of history. The very tactics that the Lost Kingdoms had used, guerrilla strikes, psychological warfare, and the exploitation of difficult terrain, were the same tools that finally brought the city of marble to its knees. The barbarians had learned from the very empire that tried to erase them, combining their ancestral ferocity with the military discipline of the Romans they had observed for generations. The Lost Kingdoms may have been wiped off the map, their cities burned and their names Latinized, but they won the long war. They proved that power is not just found in stone monuments and written laws, but in the unyielding will of a people who value freedom more than life itself. Rome is now a museum of ruins, but the spirit of the Defiant lives on in every culture that refuses to bow to an empire. The legend of the Lost Kingdoms does not end with the fall of their walls or the death of their kings. It lives on in the shifting sands and the deep roots of the European forests. To understand the true weight of their defiance, we must look at the final chapters of their struggle, the moments when the physical resistance ended and the immortal myth began. The Romans were masters of damnatio memoriae, the total erasure of a person or a nation from history. After the fall of Palmyra and the destruction of Dacia, the Roman legions stayed behind to pull down every monument and rewrite every record. They wanted the world to forget that these people had ever existed. They built their own temples over the sacred groves of the Iceni and paved their roads over the hidden paths of the Charusai. But you cannot kill the memory of a land. In the mountains of Dacia, the people did not simply become Roman. They retreated into the high valleys, keeping their language and their customs alive in the shadows of the Roman villas. Archaeologists today still find hidden caches of Dacian jewelry buried beneath Roman foundations, small, silent acts of rebellion by people who refused to let their identity be paved over. In the east, the ghost of Zenobia's Palmyra refused to sleep. Even after Aurelian's sack of the city, the Silk Road traders continued to whisper her name. She became a symbol of Eastern resistance against Western hegemony, a story told in the bazaars from Persia to India. The Romans had the power to destroy the city's stone arches, but they couldn't touch the pride of the desert. The Garamantes, watching from the deep Sahara, saw the Roman failure to hold the East and knew that time was on their side. They remained the masters of the horizon, a constant reminder that Rome's universal rule was a hollow boast. As we look back across the bridge of 2,000 years, the story of these 5 kingdoms offers a chilling and inspiring lesson. They were the outliers, the ones who saw the Roman machine, the greatest superpower the world had ever known, and said, no. They were not just fighting for territory, they were fighting for the right to exist on their own terms. The tragedy of the Lost Kingdoms is that they were often destroyed by the very thing that made them great, their love of independence. Arminius could unite the tribes for a battle, but he couldn't keep them united in peace. Boudicca's fury was a wildfire that burned too bright and too fast. Zenobia's ambition was limited by the very desert that protected her. Yet, their failures were also their greatest gifts to the future. By defying Rome, they forced the empire to change. To fight the Dacians, Rome had to reinvent its armor. To hold Britain, it had to build the greatest walls in history. To survive the Germanic raids, it had to abandon its republican roots and become a militarized state. These kingdoms, in their dying breaths, planted the seeds of Rome's own transformation into something unrecognizable and eventually, something unsustainable. The lost kingdoms are not truly lost. They are found in the languages of Europe, the ruins of the Sahara, and the spirit of every person who stands against overwhelming odds. They remind us that empires are temporary, but the human thirst for freedom is eternal. When the Roman eagles finally fell from the sky, it was the memory of these defiant realms that rose from the ashes to build the world that followed. The struggle between the Roman Empire and the defiant kingdoms was never just about borders. It was a war of the soul. Even after the legions withdrew and the emperors fell, the legacy of these 5 realms continued to shape the very fabric of human history. To conclude this chronicle, we must look at the final, invisible victory of those who refused to be broken. The Romans believed that by killing a king or burning a capital, they had ended a lineage. They were wrong. The defiance of the Cherusei, the Iceni, and the Dacians didn't die in the dirt. It moved into the blood. When the Roman Empire finally collapsed, the map of Europe didn't remain a Roman blueprint. Instead, it fractured back into the tribal identities that Rome had tried so hard to erase. The spirit of Arminius lived on in the Germanic tribes that eventually founded the nations of modern Europe. The tactical brilliance he showed in the forest became the foundation for medieval warfare. In Britain, the memory of Boudicca stayed buried like a sleeping giant. Centuries later, during the reign of Queen Elizabeth I and Queen Victoria, the image of the warrior queen was resurrected. She became a symbol of British naval power and national identity, the woman who had dared to strike the first blow against an overseas occupier. Even in the East, the legacy of Zenobia changed the way the world viewed leadership. She proved that a cosmopolitan, multi-ethnic empire could flourish in the desert, blending the wisdom of the Greeks, the Persians, and the Arabs. This cultural synthesis laid the groundwork for the great Islamic Golden Age that would later sweep across the same sands. The Romans sought to standardize the world, but the lost kingdoms proved that the world's true strength lies in its diversity. Perhaps the most haunting legacy belongs to the Garamantes. As the Roman ports in North Africa were reclaimed by the Mediterranean, the Garamantes simply faded into the deep desert. They didn't leave behind massive colosseums or triumphal arches. Instead, they left behind the life-giving water systems that still exist beneath the Sahara today. Their victory was the victory of silence. They watched the Roman Empire rise, scream its defiance at the heavens, and then wither away. They outlasted the Caesars by simply refusing to play the Roman game. They didn't need the recognition of the Senate. They needed the survival of their people. In many ways, they were the most successful of all the defiant kingdoms because they were the only ones who truly escaped the Roman shadow entirely. Today, when we look at the ruins of Roman cities like Timgad or Leptis Magna, we see the bones of a dead giant. But when we look at the resilient cultures of the desert, the mountains, and the forests, we see the descendants of the defiant. They are the living proof that no empire, no matter how vast, can ever truly own the land or the people who belong to it. The story of the lost kingdoms that defied Rome is a reminder that history is not just written by the winners, it is felt by the survivors. Every time we speak of resistance, every time a smaller nation stands up to a superpower, and every time a culture fights to keep its language alive, the spirits of Boudicca, Arminius, and Zenobia are there. Rome gave the world laws, architecture, and a common tongue. But the defiant kingdoms gave the world something more precious, the example of courage. They taught us that it is better to die on your feet than to live on your knees. They showed us that the barbarian at the gate might actually be the guardian of a different kind of civilization, one built on honor, kinship, and a deep connection to the earth. The Roman eagle is gone, but the forest still grows, the desert wind still blows, and the fire of the warrior queen still flickers in the hearts of those who dream of freedom. The lost kingdoms may be gone from the maps, but they will never be gone from our stories. They are the eternal echo of defiance, a sound that no empire can ever truly silence. The battle for the soul of the ancient world was not won with a final treaty or a single decisive blow. It was won through the slow erosion of an idea, the idea that Rome was inevitable. As we delve into the final echoes of these legendary resistances, we see how the defeated became the architects of the future. The story of the lost kingdoms that defied Rome is a reminder that history is not just written by the winners, it is felt by the survivors. Every time we speak of resistance, every time a smaller nation stands up to a superpower, and every time a culture fights to keep its language alive, the spirits of Boudica, Arminius, and Zenobia are there. Rome gave the world laws, architecture, and a common tongue. But the defiant kingdoms gave the world something more precious, the example of courage. They taught us that it is better to die on your feet than to live on your knees. They showed us that the barbarian at the gate might actually be the guardian of a different kind of civilization, one built on honor, kinship, and a deep connection to the earth. The Roman eagle is gone, but the forest still grows, the desert wind still blows, and the fire of the warrior queen still flickers in the hearts of those who dream of freedom. The lost kingdoms may be gone from the maps, but they will never be gone from our stories. They are the eternal echo of defiance, a sound that no empire can ever truly silence. The battle for the soul of the ancient world was not won with a final treaty or a single decisive blow. It was won through the slow erosion of an idea, the idea that Rome was inevitable. As we delve into the final echoes of these legendary resistances, we see how the defeated became the architects of the future. In the centuries following the peak of Roman power, the empire underwent a process called Romanization, but the lost kingdoms performed a silent infiltration. The Germanic tribes didn't just fight Rome, they joined it, eventually becoming the backbone of the Roman military. The very sons of the tribes Arminius had united were now the generals leading the legions. However, they carried with them the ancestral stories of the Teutoburg forest. They were Romans in name, but their loyalties remained with the land and the kin. This created a ghost in the machine. When the central authority of Rome began to flicker, these soldiers didn't fight to save the Senate. They fought to carve out their own domains. The Dacian spirit of mountain independence morphed into the resilient cultures of the Balkans. The icy-nice fierce tribalism evolved into the unique identity of the British Isles, which would eventually challenge every empire that tried to cross the English Channel. Rome had spent centuries trying to digest these kingdoms, but it found they were made of iron and flint. The empire couldn't break them down, so it eventually choked on them. The lost kingdoms became the internal fractures that caused the Roman pillar to finally shatter under its own weight. As the sun set on the Western Roman Empire in 476 AD, the world didn't fall into a dark void. Instead, it returned to the hands of the people who had never truly surrendered. The map began to look remarkably like it had before the Roman conquest, but with a new layer of sophistication. The Germanic kingdoms emerged stronger, the East reclaimed its Palmyrene-inspired splendor, and the desert remained the unconquerable sanctuary of the Garamantes. The true victory of the lost kingdoms was that they outlasted the Roman concept of the world. Rome believed there was only one way to be civilized, one way to govern, and one way to pray. The defiance of these 5 realms proved that there are many ways to be great. They taught the world that diversity is a defense mechanism and that centralizing all power in one city is a recipe for eventual collapse. Today, the names of Varus and Suetonius Paulinus are footnotes in history books, but the names of Arminius, Boudica, and Zenobia are etched into the stone of national identity. They are the patron saints of the underdog. Their stories are told not just as history, but as warnings to the powerful and anthems for the oppressed. The story of the lost kingdoms that defied Rome is the story of us. It is the story of the human spirit's refusal to be a line item in someone else's ledger. It is the story of the forest against the road, the mountain against the wall, and the desert against the map. Rome left us the ruins of their ambition, vast, cold, and silent. But the defiant kingdoms left us a living legacy, vibrant, chaotic, and loud. They remind us that while an empire can build a road that lasts 1,000 years, it cannot build a spirit that lasts forever. Only freedom can do that. As we close this chronicle, we look back at the Rhine, the fens of Britain, the Syrian sands, the Dacian peaks, and the deep Sahara. The legions are gone. The eagles have fallen. But if you listen closely to the wind in the trees or the shifting of the dunes, you can still hear the war cries of the unconquered. They are the ghosts that Rome could never catch, and they are the heroes who remind us that no matter how dark the shadow of an empire grows, the light of defiance will always find a way to break through. The struggle for sovereignty did not end with the fall of the Western Roman Empire. Instead, the archetypes of these 5 kingdoms became the blueprint for every resistance movement that followed in the medieval and modern eras. To conclude this epic saga, we must examine the final, spiritual transformation of these defiant realms, from physical territories to eternal symbols of human liberty.